Someone sat down at a keyboard, opened an AI model built by one of the most talked about companies on earth, and typed in a question that has haunted human beings for 2,000 years. Read the book of Revelation. What came back wasn't a date. It wasn't a countdown. But it was enough to make the person reading it go still for a second, because the machine didn't just summarize an old text. It started drawing connections between a vision written by a man exiled on a rocky island in the Aegean Sea near the end of the 1st century and headlines sitting on phones right now in 2026. This is a story about that experiment. What an AI actually does when you point it at the strangest, most argued over book in the Bible. What it finds, what it doesn't find, and why, after 2,000 years of people swearing they've finally cracked the code, the honest answer is still more unsettling than a fake deadline ever could be. Let's start with the text itself, because almost nobody who's afraid of Revelation has actually sat down and read it slowly. It was written, according to nearly all biblical scholars, by a man named John, exiled to the island of Patmos, likely during the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian, somewhere around 95 AD. It's addressed to 7 actual churches in Asia Minor, real congregations dealing with real persecution, real economic pressure, real political power, crushing down on them from the Roman Empire. And from that starting point, the text explodes into some of the strangest imagery ever put into Scripture. Beasts rising out of the sea, a woman clothed with the sun, a dragon with 7 heads, a number 666 attached to a beast that demands worship, plagues, trumpets, bowls of wrath poured out one after another, a final battle at a place called Armageddon, and at the end, a new heaven and a new earth. To the original readers in those 7 churches, much of this imagery wouldn't have felt abstract at all. A beast with the number of a man, 666, most scholars agree, likely functioned as a coded reference to a specific Roman emperor, using a common ancient practice called gematria, where letters in Hebrew and Greek double as numbers, so that a name could be hidden inside a number without ever being written down where a Roman censor could read it as treason. Babylon, the great city drenched in luxury and blood in the text, almost certainly stood in for Rome itself, the empire that had already destroyed one Babylon-like city in living memory, Jerusalem, and now sat as the dominant, seemingly invincible power over the entire known world. Writing plainly that Rome would fall while living inside the Roman Empire was not a safe thing to do. Coding it in divisions of beasts and dragons and cosmic battles let the text survive, and let its message of ultimate hope reach the exact people who needed to hear it, all while flying under the radar of the empire it was quietly condemning. That's the layer most casual readers and most viral videos skip entirely. Before you can ask what Revelation means for the future, you have to reckon with the fact that it was, at minimum, also speaking directly and urgently to its own present. And that single fact is exactly why, for 2,000 years, Christians have argued about what all of this actually means. And that argument hasn't quietly faded into consensus. It's hardened into 4 major, genuinely serious interpretive traditions, and any honest AI model or honest scholar walking through this text has to grapple with all 4 of them rather than picking the flashiest one. The first is called the preterist view. Under this reading, the beast, the persecution, the fall of Babylon, these are coded references to Rome and to the Jewish-Roman war that ended with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. In this view, Revelation isn't a forecast of our future. It's an encrypted letter of hope to a suffering church, written in symbols, because writing it plainly would have gotten the author and his readers executed. The second is the historicist view, popular for centuries, especially among Reformation-era Protestants. It reads Revelation as a panoramic sweep of church history itself, from John's time all the way to the end of the world, with specific empires, popes, and historical movements mapped onto specific symbols in the text as history unfolds. Historicists have, over the centuries, identified the beast as everything from the Roman Empire to the Ottoman Empire to specific historical figures, revising their interpretations, generation after generation, as history kept moving past their predicted endpoints. Martin Luther himself, during the Reformation, publicly identified the papacy of his own era with the Antichrist, described in Revelation, a reading that shaped centuries of Protestant thought and helped fuel one of the largest religious upheavals in European history. Later, historicist writers shifted their identification of the beast entirely as new empires rose and fell. Napoleon, the Ottoman Empire even, in the 20th century, various totalitarian regimes, each new candidate replacing the last one as history simply refused to stop moving past the deadline. The third is the futurist view, the one most familiar to modern audiences, especially in the U.S., through books and films built around the rapture and the end times. This reading holds that most of Revelation, especially from chapter 4 onward, describes events still ahead of us, a future tribulation, a future Antichrist, a future final battle. This is the interpretive lens most responsible for the idea that current headlines, wars, technology, geopolitical alignments might be fulfilling prophecy in real time. And the fourth is the idealist view, which treats Revelation less as a coded timeline of specific events and more as a symbolic depiction of the ongoing, timeless struggle between good and evil, one that repeats itself in every generation rather than pointing at any single moment in history. Here's the thing worth sitting with. All four of these frameworks are held by serious, credentialed theologians. None of them has ever definitively defeated the others, and that's exactly the terrain an AI model steps into the moment you ask it to analyze Revelation. So what actually happens when you run that experiment? When you ask a large language model to read Revelation and cross-reference it against history and current events, it does something very specific. It doesn't have a hidden channel to the future. It doesn't run a secret numerical decryption that theologians missed for 2 millennia. What it does is pattern match. It pulls from the same enormous body of commentary, historical scholarship, and interpretive tradition that human theologians have built for 2,000 years, and it looks for the connections that already exist inside that tradition. That's not nothing. It's actually a fascinating exercise because the model can surface historicist and futurist readings side by side, faster and more comprehensively than most individual readers ever could on their own. Think about what a task like this actually requires. Revelation is only 22 chapters long, but the commentary written about it, across 2,000 years in dozens of languages, spanning monastic scholars, Reformation preachers, 20th century evangelical bestsellers, and modern academic theologians, is almost impossibly vast. No single human being could realistically hold all four major interpretive traditions in their head simultaneously, cross-reference each one against a specific current headline, and lay out where they agree and where they sharply diverge, all within a matter of seconds. That is genuinely what a large language model is built to do well. It's a real capability, and it's worth being impressed by it. What it is not doing, no matter how the output is worded, is consulting a source of information unavailable to human scholars. It has no access to the future. It is, at its core, an extremely well-read research assistant, not an oracle. And when it does that, some of the parallels it surfaces are genuinely striking, in the same way they've been striking to readers for centuries. Take the restoration of Israel. In 1948, the modern state of Israel was formally established, an event that futurist readers have pointed to for decades as a key marker, because a regathering of Israel plays a role in several futurist timelines drawn from Revelation and other prophetic books. That's a real, documented historical event, and it's real that many people have read prophetic significance into it. It's also true that scholars who hold the preterist or idealist views read that same event very differently as modern geopolitics, not prophetic fulfillment. Take surveillance technology. Revelation describes a system where no one can buy or sell without a mark. In a world of biometric payments, digital currency, facial recognition, and near-total data tracking, it's easy to see why that image feels uncomfortably close to home. An AI model asked to draw a parallel here isn't inventing anything. It's noticing something that Christian writers and preachers have already been noticing and writing about since the 1970s, long before AI existed, back when the mark was associated with barcodes and social security numbers instead of smartphones. Every new technology that touched commerce, credit cards in the 80s, the internet in the 90s, smartphones in the 2010s, has been folded into that same reading in its own decade, each time presented as the final missing piece, and each time eventually replaced by whatever came next. This is worth pausing on, because it's the real mechanism behind almost everything that feels eerie about this kind of analysis. Apocalyptic literature, by design, uses broad, elastic categories. A beast that demands worship and controls commerce could describe Rome. It could describe a modern surveillance state. It could describe almost any sufficiently powerful, sufficiently invasive system of centralized control, because that's precisely the kind of threat the original author was writing about. And that kind of threat has existed, in one form or another, in every century since. The text isn't narrowly specific enough to point at only one moment in history. It's broad enough to plausibly describe dozens of them. That elasticity is a feature of how the genre works, not evidence that any particular reading has finally, uniquely been confirmed. This is the actual, honest reason Revelation keeps feeling relevant, generation after generation. It isn't because it's secretly encoding a real fixed date. It's because the imagery in the text, beasts representing empires, economic control systems, plagues, war, persecution, is broad and archetypal enough that it can be mapped onto almost any era of human upheaval, and every era has upheaval. Rome fit it. The Reformation-era church saw the papacy fit it. The world wars fit it, the Cold War fit it, and today's surveillance states and geopolitical tensions fit it too. That's not proof of a hidden, validated prophecy. It's a real, well-documented pattern in how apocalyptic literature functions. And it's exactly what a large enough model trained on 2,000 years of commentary would surface, because that's what's actually in the historical record. Which brings us to the part of this story that should genuinely concern anyone paying attention, and it isn't a secret AI-cracked countdown. It's the track record of people who have insisted they finally found the real date. In the 1830s and 1840s, a Baptist preacher named William Miller became convinced, through his own close reading of biblical prophecy, that he had calculated the exact year of Christ's return. Tens of thousands of followers across the United States sold their possessions, left their farms, and gathered on hillsides to wait. When the date passed without incident, and then a second predicted date after that, the event became known in American religious history as the Great Disappointment. Some of Miller's followers lost everything they owned. Communities were shattered. In 1994, radio broadcaster Harold Camping predicted the end of the world based on his own numerical analysis of Scripture. When that date failed, he recalculated and predicted a new date in 2011, claiming the rapture would occur on May 21st of that year, with the actual end of the world following on October 21st. His media organization spent millions of dollars on billboards and advertising campaigns across the globe. Some of his followers, believing him completely, quit their jobs, spent their life savings, and in at least one documented case, a family said they told their young children not to bother saving for college because there wouldn't be a future to save for. When May 21st passed with nothing happening, Camping said he'd made a mathematical error and doubled down on October. When that date passed too, he eventually admitted publicly that no one can know the timing, and he stepped back from public prophecy, teaching entirely before his death a few years later. And in the lead up to the year 2000, an entirely different kind of apocalyptic panic gripped the world, not built on revelation directly, but carrying the same emotional charge. A fear that computer systems worldwide would catastrophically fail at the stroke of midnight, unraveling banking, power grids, and infrastructure all at once. People stockpiled food and cash. Some moved to remote areas. The clock struck midnight, and the world kept turning. And these aren't isolated, quirky footnotes confined to a couple of unlucky decades. Long before Miller or Camping, entire centuries of church history are dotted with confident predictions that quietly, embarrassingly failed. Some early church writers believed the end would arrive within their own lifetimes, based on their reading of exactly the same passages people point to today. Medieval writers linked the year 1000 to the end of the age, tying it to a specific line in Revelation, about a 1,000-year period, and again, the year passed uneventfully, life went on, taxes still got collected. In the 1970s, a single best-selling book built almost entirely around the idea that Cold War geopolitics, the rise of European political unification, and the return of Israel signaled an imminent, specific end-times timeline, sold tens of millions of copies, and convinced an entire generation of readers that the countdown had already started. That generation has largely passed on. The book's specific predictions did not come to pass. Several very different eras, several very different mechanisms of prediction, built on everything from handwritten calculations to computer code to, now, artificial intelligence and the exact same ending every single time. Life continued. And in every one of those cases, real people made real, often devastating decisions based on a certainty that turned out to be false. This is the actual history an honest analysis has to reckon with, and it's why serious theologians across all four interpretive camps, preterist, historicist, futurist, and idealist, tend to agree on one thing, even when they agree on almost nothing else. Confident date setting has an unbroken, unblemished record of failure, stretching back to the earliest centuries of the church, and there is no reason, statistical or theological, to believe that pattern is about to break now just because the tool doing the pattern matching happens to be an AI model instead of a 19th century preacher with a chart. So what does it actually mean that an AI can surface these parallels between Revelation and today's world, faster and more comprehensively than any human reader could manage alone? It means the model is doing exactly what it was built to do, drawing connections across an enormous body of text. It's genuinely interesting that it can hold four competing, centuries-old interpretive traditions in view at once and show you how each one would read a single passage differently. It's genuinely interesting that a surveillance-heavy, digitally tracked, geopolitically unstable world in 2026 shares surface-level imagery with a text written in the first century. That convergence is real, and it's worth sitting with. What it doesn't mean, and what no serious reading of the text supports, is that a date, a timeline, or a confirmed countdown has been unlocked. The text itself, remarkably, addresses this directly, and it does so in the plainest language in the entire book. In the Gospels, describing the very kind of end-times events Revelation depicts, the words attributed to Jesus are direct. No one knows the day or the hour, not the angels in heaven, not even the Son, only the Father. It's a line early Christian writers took seriously enough that it shaped how the entire New Testament treats the subject of prophetic timing as something to live in readiness for, not something to calculate your way toward with a spreadsheet, a chart, or now a chatbot. That tension between a text so vivid and specific that it feels like it must be describing something concrete happening right now, and a tradition that explicitly warns against ever claiming to know when, is the actual, honest heart of why Revelation still unsettles people 2,000 years after it was written. It isn't that a machine finally cracked a hidden code, it's that the text was built deliberately to sit permanently on the edge of that question, forcing every generation that reads it seriously to ask quietly whether it might be talking about them without ever letting anyone prove that it is. Maybe that's actually the more interesting story than a fake deadline ever could be. Not that an algorithm found the answer, but that a document written for a handful of persecuted churches in the first century has been read by every single generation since. And every single one of them has looked at their own moment in history and felt, at least for a while, like the text was written for them. Rome felt it, the Cold War felt it, and now, watching surveillance systems spread and nations reposition themselves on a map that's shifted more in the last few years than in the previous few decades combined, it's not surprising that people are feeling it again, AI or no AI. What history actually shows, again and again without exception, is that every person who has claimed with confidence to have finally located the exact moment, the exact date, the exact sign that confirms the countdown has begun, has been wrong. Every single time, not most times. Every time, and the people who paid the real cost for that confidence weren't the ones making the predictions. It was the people who believed them enough to act on it, who sold their homes, drained their savings, and reorganized their entire lives around a certainty that never arrived. So if you walk away from a conversation with an AI model that's just read Revelation front to back and cross-referenced it against the news, feeling like something eerie is converging, that feeling is worth taking seriously. Not because it means the ending is near, but because it means you're standing in the exact same place every generation before you has stood, looking at a 2,000-year-old text in a genuinely unstable world and wondering if this is finally the moment. It probably isn't. It never has been before. But the fact that the question keeps returning, generation after generation, technology after technology, might be the actual point of the book. Not to hand you a date, but to keep you asking the question at all. If this kind of deep dive into how old texts, history, and modern technology collide is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe, because we're only getting started.